Order. Jim Shannon to move the motion.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that this House is considered a matter of gender-specific religious persecution. It's always a pleasure to speak in Westminster Hall, Madam Chair. I'm very pleased to be under your chairmanship. We seem to be often in these two roles, you as chairperson and myself as a participant in these debates. Also very pleased to see the Honourable Lady, the Shadow Minister, in her place. I'm not sure if it's the first time maybe we've done a debate, this type of debate together. And always a pleasure to see the Minister in his place because he understands these issues. And when we put forward a viewpoint, we're always assured that the response that we're seeking will one that he will deliver very positively and very helpfully. I'm always mindful as well that the Thursday afternoon, Madam Chair, sometimes is what we refer to as the graveyard shift. The fact is, the House has been in I think from Tuesday there's been no whip, or not the same level of whipping, so it gives you an indication that many people are away. It doesn't lessen, Madam Chair, and the point I'm making doesn't lessen the importance of this issue. We had sought perhaps maybe to have this debate earlier to tie in with International Women's Day, but that opportunity didn't arrive for us. So I'm very pleased to see my two colleagues and two dear friends, the Honourable Lady, who's today the spokesperson for the Scots Nats Party, and also my very dear friend, the Honourable Lady for Congleton, who along as the Prime Minister's Special Envoy, and we know the great work that she does, and we say it because it's true, not for any other reason. The Honourable Lady works energetically on these issues, and we're very pleased to see her in that place. The Honourable Lady for the who's shadow spokesman for the Scots Nats, of course, she and I were the joint requesters for this debate. So the two of us in particular are very pleased to be able to introduce this debate. I thank the Honourable Lady as well for her continued advocacy for vulnerable women and girls around the world. So this debate is incredibly timely. Earlier this month it was International Women's Day, a day which offers time to take stock of how far we've advanced the rights of women. All of us in this House are committed to that goal, but it's also an opportunity to reflect on the advances that need to be made, where we've got to, and indeed where we need to be as well. And sadly, when it concerns freedom of religion or belief, the strides we need to take to ensure this right for women and girls are significant. There's a whole lot more to do, Madam Chair, and others will illustrate that matter whenever they have an opportunity to express themselves as well. It's also a time, I believe, to look back at what's been achieved and to look forward to what we want to achieve. And while violations of freedom of religion or belief can affect any member of a minority religious community, religious persecution is not gender blind. Women and girls from persecuted religious or belief communities face a double vulnerability. Not only are they at greater risk of freedom of religion or belief abuses, but these abuses often have a greater impact on the lives of women and girls than they do for men. As the Christian advocacy organisation Open Doors describes, and everyone here will be aware of it, the gender-specific religious persecution is hidden, but it is violent and it is complex. And unfortunately, it is too often ignored by policymakers, by NGOs and by local authorities. This is a case, I'm going to give a couple of examples to illustrate it. I think, unfortunately, these examples are hard sometimes, Madam Chair, to listen to because there is graphic detail without getting into perhaps all the things that happened, but it's what the experiences are of young girls. First case is a young girl called Mira Bahat. Just a few days ago, 14-year-old Mira Bahat, a Hindu girl from Mirpurkhas, Pakistan, was abducted and forced to marry her abductor and to convert from Hinduism. Just this week, we met and we had a chance to meet some of the Hindu representatives and to discuss some of the things that are happening for them. We intend as an APPG, of course, to take these matters forward and there'll be further engagement between us and with them, and collectively we will try to act on behalf of what's happening to some Hindus in Bangladesh in particular. But this young girl is from Pakistan. This 14-year-old girl was abducted, forcibly married, and forced to change her religion. And forced to change their religion. When a child is abducted, of course, any child, there would be outrage. In this case, there didn't seem to be. To say this girl was forcibly married is to put it politely. In reality, unfortunately, Madam Chair, this young 14-year-old girl was brutally raped. But do we hear about such abuse of power, abuse of religion? Do we hear about the abuse of human dignity in the news? No, we don't. And that's why this debate today is so important, and why we have a duty. And the three of us here, and the Shadow and the Minister have a duty as well to respond to these issues and highlight them, but also to deal with them. All too often these cases are flagrantly ignored by the international media, just as they are ignored by local authorities. Where the crimes take place, a culture of impunity seems to prevail. In their recent report, Hear Her Cries, Aid to the Church in Need, found that up to 1,000 Christian and Hindu girls are abducted in Pakistan each year, many of whom are forcibly converted and so-called married. That married is in inverted commas because it's certainly not married where you say where you agree to it, and certainly not when you're an underage girl. To make this matter worse, Madam Chair, this number is likely to be a conservative estimate, so it could be even more than 1,000, which greatly worries us. And very few of these girls' names ever make it out of Pakistan. We might hear of it through the APPG, the Special Envoy will hear it, the Honourable Lady will hear it, but for us it is incredibly difficult to listen to and to hear the grief, the pain, the agony of vulnerable young girls and parents unable to respond. Early reports in Mira Bahat's case state that when her parents approached the judge that he sided with Mira's abductor, as he had recorded a video of her renouncing her faith. Under duress, Madam Chair, but the courts, if they're sympathetic to the case, then they seem to turn a blind eye to some of the things that happen. So much of Mira's case is uncertain, and we do not know what the future holds for her, but her parents are worried for her. And in this House today, I do believe, and I myself and my contribution, I'm putting the case forward for wee Mira Bahat. But all too often, such confessions are manipulated, coerced, forced, and abused, and sometimes violently. At the end of the day, this is a girl, a 14-year-old girl, taken from her home, taken from her family, and violently and repeatedly abused. To highlight the importance of responding to such cases, I'd also like to draw, if I can, Madam Chair, the Minister and all members present, to the abduction of Farah Shaheen, a 14-year-old Christian girl whose abductions share many similarities with Mira's. Farah was kidnapped from Hasselbad on the 25th of June 2020 at the age of 12 years. That is really hard to take in, Madam Chair. It's even harder for me as a grandfather with the oldest grandchild I have is a wee girl of 12, and I just look at the innocence of Katie, and I think this 12-year-old girl in Pakistan was abducted, kidnapped, and abused. And how would I feel as a grandfather, or as a father, as a parent, as one of the family members? This young 12-year-old back in 20 was forcibly married, which basically means, Madam Chair, that she was raped and forced to convert to Islam. During months of sexual enslavement, she was shackled and forced to work long hours cleaning animal dung in the yard of her abductor, a man named Kaiser Ahmad Ali. Farah stated, "I was chained most of the time. It was terrible. They put the chains round my ankles of a wee 12-year-old, and they tied her with a rope. She tried to cut the rope, she tried to escape, and tried to get the chains off, but couldn't manage it. And she prayed every night, as a Christian girl would do, asking God to help her. A desperate plea, a plea for help whenever you have society that seems to think Hindus and Christian girls don't have rights, but they do." Her father, Asif Massey highlighted the impact that this time had on his daughter. And he said, Farah told me she was treated as a slave. She was forced to work all day, cleaning filth in a cattle yard, and they repeatedly raped my daughter. That was the father who must have been nearby himself with anxiety, with concern. She was in trauma after being subjected to physical and medical torture. Eventually, and we thank goodness for this, on the 16th of February 2021, after a lengthy court process, the Hyderabad District and Sessions Court ruled that her marriage was unlawful because on the grounds that she hadn't been registered properly and she was allowed to go home at long last, but not after the abuse that had taken place, not after the kidnapping that took place, not after the physical torture that took place. So this case, I believe, illustrates how authorities often turn a blind eye to gender-specific persecution. And after Farah's abduction, it took place 3 months before they could even file a first information report, before they even get themselves out of off their chairs and do something, which starts off any police investigation in Pakistan 3 months before they did anything, while a family and a parents and family were desperate to know what was going on. The investigation was dropped with no action taken against the 3 men who were involved in her kidnapping and Farah's abduction. And even the eventual court ruling was a civil matter rather than a legal one. So where is the legal support in Pakistan for young Hindu and Christian girls? It certainly doesn't seem to be apparent or available. Despite the horrors that Farah endured, her abductors were let off with absolute impunity. And I find that incredibly difficult to take. And if I find that, not as a family member, but as a concerned person, and a member of Parliament who wishes to put forward these issues, then how much more did the parents feel? Not only does this deny justice to Farah for the atrocities committed against her, but it lays the groundwork for further abductions, because others will say, well, look, they get off, we can do the same, because ultimately we can get away with it. And as the evil men who consider such cruelty know they will not face repercussions. I should have declared an interest at the beginning, Madam Chair. Apologies for not doing it. As Chair of the APPG in Freedom of Religious Belief, and also Chair of the APPG for Pakistan Religious Minorities, both of which I chair and which I'm very, very pleased and privileged to do so, humbled to do so indeed. I'd like to remind the House that this is not an isolated issue as this one for young Farah, but simply 2 cases of 1,000 girls like Farah and Mira who endured this abuse last year in Pakistan. 1,000 girls, and he said earlier on, I think that's the tip of the iceberg. And unfortunately, such tragedy is not unique to Pakistan. Open Doors reports that of the top 50 countries featured in the World Watch list in 2022, which was just released there back in January, which the Honourable Lady for Chipping Barnett is the person who sponsors that every year. 88% cited cases of forced marriage of women and girls as a form of religious persecution. And tellingly, no country reported its use against men, because it's more often than not men who abuse young women and young girls. In Afghanistan, the rights of women are severely limited because of the Taliban extreme interpretation of Sharia law. Some women, however, experience further challenges, especially those belonging to religious or belief minorities. And whilst men may suffer from verbal and physical abuse in public places due to their external identity, whether by turban or beard, women also fear this, and women and girls from minority religions remove themselves from the male gaze. They keep themselves under the radar by either remaining indoors or covering themselves entirely in a burqa when in public. It is also no secret that women suffer sexual violence too. And that's what we see so often in today's world, is the sexual violence where men seem to think they can do what they want. We need to have a strict, hard law that makes sure that they know they can't. The very nature of religious dress for women of some religions leads to women facing greater difficulty in exercising their right to freedom of religion or belief. At least 11 states in Europe, Africa and South Asia impose public restrictions or bans on Muslim head coverings, despite the fact that some women regard it as an integral part of their faith or their identity. It's about protection. It's about what their religion tells them to do. Women may also feel under great pressure to conceal or perhaps underplay their religious identity to make themselves less identifiable as belonging to a religious group, or indeed even more moderate in their outlook. Religious dress may seem a trivial form of infringement upon freedom of religion or belief, but wherever violations of that nature takes place, one more grave examples of forced marriage and sexual exploitation are not far behind. So forced marriage and sexual exploitation of women and girls has been seen as a tactic to stem the growth of religious minority communities, and it goes underreported and indeed under-recognised. Despite its enormous scale, in 2020, during the peak of the COVID-19 outbreak around the world, Open Doors reported that the number one pressure point for women was forced marriage. When you say "I do," it's a commitment by both parties to do that. It's a willing one. But in the cases that we're explaining here, there is no choice for the young girls at all, whether they're Hindu or indeed Christians. It seems that the law of the land in Pakistan and other countries is one where the bias lies with the male part of that marriage. Forced marriages and the weaponisation of sexual violence is a tactic that devastates religious minority communities. Children born out of forced marriages and forced conversions are often forced to take on the religious identity of their perpetrator and are left with a legal religious identity which is difficult or indeed even impossible to change. And sadly, in many cases around the world, survivors of rape and sexual violence face ostracisation from their own community, often leaving these women either unable to marry and have children, or forced to leave the community and cut off from support networks. Heartbreakingly, in some cases, this has resulted in survivors returning to their abusers as there's no safe place for them to go. How sad that is, Madam Chair, to have to go back to an abusive relationship that you don't want to because no one else will take you. None of your family members will reach out. No one in society will say, "Can we help this young girl? Can we make life better for them?" The tactic is seen in many countries, but perhaps the starkest recent example is, and it's one that's still fresh in my mind, but fresh in the mind of others in this House, is the 2014 atrocities committed by Daesh against religious minorities, including Yazidis and Christians. I don't think, Madam Chair, that there's ever a time that I don't think about that particular one and the brutality that we witnessed, that we don't have an ache in our heart for the Yazidi men and for women and young girls who have been abducted and have never been seen again. Daesh specifically targeted religious minority women and girls through the use of abductions of women and children, exploitations of rape, of sexual violence, and forced marriage in an attempt to annihilate religious diversity and establish their caliphate. Many of the women and girls abducted by Daesh in northern Iraq in 2014 are still missing. One of my requests to the Minister will be this, to see what has happened to the 2,763 Yazidi women and children. Despite the collapse of the Daesh Caliphate in 2019, no real effort, unfortunately, has been made to locate them or to ensure that they are rescued and reunited with their families. And according to survivors, girls abducted by Daesh fighters were trafficked to Syria, then to Iran by Iranian soldiers. So what can we do in this one? What can we do to help? Where can we make inquiries or investigations to see if we can return those Yazidi women and girls back to their families, reunite them with those who love them and miss them, and do that. And if this is true, what is indicated to us, then the Yazidi girls could now be in a range of possible countries. They could be in a dozen countries or maybe more. So I'm very grateful, and I put it on record, to Lord Alton of Liverpool for calling upon the United Kingdom Government to investigate this situation and engage in a dialogue with the Iranian Government to clarify the issue and then to ensure the safe return of the Yazidi girls if they have indeed been trafficked to Iran. I very much welcome the release of Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe and others as well, and I put it on record my thanks to the Minister, the Secretary of State, to the Minister here, to all the civil servants who worked industriously hard behind backs. Sometimes we don't see things happening at the speed we wish to see, but I think we are greatly encouraged by the release of Nazan and that reunion on TV this morning when we've seen her with her husband and with her daughter again and with all the family. I think it was one that greatly encouraged us, and we do. I think have to put in record our thanks to in the perseverance of her husband, who clearly through his hunger strike highlighted this issue. But we thank government for working behind backs, making the steps that were made. The Minister was on the TV this morning. I seen him on TV and he was speaking about it. The deal is a confidential deal, and we understand that. But we've got her home, and there's been great rejoicing about that happening. But we are still waiting for answers in relation to the Yazidi girls in Iran. Other states must follow suit and engage the Iranian government in seeking the truth about the whereabouts of the Yazidi women and girls. And these Yazidi girls and others like them need to be reunited with their families. And I can remember meeting some of them here in the House way back in about 2014, 2015, I think it was. Their stories were hard to comprehend. The violence, the cruelty, the complete disregard for their rights, and physically, emotionally, they were abused. States must do more, much more, to ensure the safe return of trafficked women and girls. International organisations need to support and guide states through this process, and indeed accommodate it. It is imperative that women and girls who have endured horrific abuse are found, rescued, and allowed to go home. Well, there was some rejoicing that those 2,763 Yazidi women and girls were able to return home, to be reunited with their family, and again have the joy of the life that they once had, if that's possible. Currently, the vast majority of Daesh fighters are only prosecuted for terrorism-related offences. They need to be charged with more. However, it is important that we seek justice for these women. Daesh fighters must be prosecuted for their other crimes, including the murder, the kidnapping, the forced marriage, the trafficking, and other forms of sexual violence. This is one of the recommendations of the 2019 Truro review, which our government has pledged to enact in full. We haven't seen much of that yet, Minister, unfortunately, and maybe you can give us some indication on where we would be with that. I think it's really important that we see that part of the Truro review being delivered. And in many parts of the world, the acts constituting human trafficking and subsequent enslavement and abuse are not being investigated and indeed prosecuted. In the cases when domestic courts are not equipped to prosecute, the international community needs to come together to ensure that courts can fulfil their legal duties, even if that entails resorting to the establishment of international tribunals, which I believe, if it's necessary, let's do it. We all share in the duty, I believe, to deliver justice for these women. Last year, the UN found that ISIS had committed genocide against the Yazidis, including the abduction, the forced marriage and the conversion of Yazidi women and girls. In November 2021, a German court found that Taha al-Jamili was guilty of crimes against humanity and genocide. And they cited the abduction and the killing of a 5-year-old girl. My goodness me. One of my youngest, I have 5 grandchildren, 3 girls and 2 boys, and I just think, how would anybody do that against a young girl? And the forced trafficking of her mother. They killed their child and then they sold her into slavery. These crimes do not bear thinking about. But today, through this debate, I believe we must highlight the issue, and sadly, too often we don't. But today we have had opportunity. Let us not deceive ourselves into thinking this is an internal matter for countries to deal with. The UK has an obligation under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide to prevent such crimes from escalating. The Truro Review recommends that Her Majesty's Government seeks to prosecute Daesh members not only as terrorists, but as perpetrators of sex crimes against Yazidi and Christian women. At present, this has not been done. So I encourage the Minister and my government to address this before the report's 3rd-year review this summer, only a few months away. I want to conclude, Madam Chair, by welcoming the commitments that Her Majesty's Government has made to promote gender equality and address discrimination around the world, including the announcement by the Foreign Secretary of the creation of a summit focusing on preventing sexual violence against women. That's a really significant step, and we welcome that. And the proposal to build a new consensus on sexual violence and conflict as a red line. I think the more you become aware of it, the more you want to stop it. And I can't stop it myself, and none of us here individually can, but our Minister and our government can take the steps to make it happen. But more needs to be done. Victims of gender-specific religious persecution are so often overlooked, and the compounding elements of religion and gender are too often ignored, sorry to say, by the FCDO. So I urge Her Majesty's Government to make defending women and girls and religious minorities a core value that should encompass all areas of foreign affairs, including our very trade policy. We should ensure that all new trade agreements, indeed all trade agreements that we have, include human rights provisions that consider any religious or belief-based persecution and its gendered components. And secondly, I believe we need to ensure that UK overseas aid and development programmes include safeguards to recognise the signs of gender-specific religious or belief-based persecution, and particularly be aware of the risk of abduction, of forced marriage and the conversion of girls from religious minority communities. I give two examples, one of a Christian girl, one of a Hindu girl earlier on. Whenever that's happening, in the example of Pakistan, but in other parts of the world, then we need to do something. This is particularly important for Pakistan, where abuses are rife, and yet it is the largest recipient, Pakistan, the largest recipient of UK overseas development spending. I do, Madam Chair, believe it's time to make that aid conditional. That it is time to add protections and make sure that religious minorities, Hindu or Christian or other ethnic groups, have protection, and aid spending can be a method to do that. Finally, I conclude with this comment, Madam Chair. More needs to be done to help find and rescue the 2,763 Yazidi women and children who are still missing. There's an ache in my heart when I think of them. I know there's an ache in other members' hearts here as well. I think we have a duty to try and help them, to find out where they are, to try and bring them home to the place where they once were living in safety. Survivors need to receive adequate assistance, including the medical and perhaps maybe the psychological help that they need, financial support to set up in their homes again, and access to justice. Access to justice for those who have abused them, and that is needed to help rebuild their lives. Impunity for these crimes must be tackled. There has to be accountability in this process. I believe we owe it to these religious communities around the world. I believe, Madam Chair, we owe it to women and girls for what they've endured. It's time to bring it to an end. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered gender-specific religious persecution. Fiona Bruce.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and I congratulate the Honourable Member for Strangford for calling this debate, and forgive me, Minister, but several of the points which he has made I too will be making, but I think that bearing in mind the numbers of women, indeed the millions of women around the world who are suffering these abuses, they bear repetition. Freedom of religion or belief is a fundamental human right, extending to everyone, everywhere, without distinction of any kind, such as race, ethnicity, gender, political or other opinion, economic or social status. The three main components of FoRB are the right to have a religion or belief, to change this, and to practice it. Unfortunately, millions around the world today cannot do so freely. And whilst religious persecution against men tends to be focused and often public, such as killings during conflict, religious persecution against women is more likely to be complex and hidden, but it too can be very violent. Indeed, global FoRB violations against women, as women, I believe can be characterised in three words: complex, violent, and hidden. Yet despite the often distinctive nature of FoRB abuses of women, often sexual, until recently, much of the research and data on FoRB has been gender blind, possibly because the majority of official representatives of religion and belief communities across the world are men, and possibly also because their experiences have been used as a default reference. Yet in many societies, men and women live very different lives. Women all too often don't have the same access to resources. They are assigned different roles in societies, and many women do not exercise the same autonomy as men, even in relation to their religion or belief practices in their local communities, let alone in other ways. What's becoming increasingly clear is that the factors which result in religious persecution against women are many and complex, and we all, including those of us, and I include myself, who work on FoRB for much of the time, need to better understand these. Some work has been done on this by the FCDO in response to the Truro Review recommendation number 5, but not, in my view, enough. And I want to put that on record now as the 3-year deadline for the Truro Review, independent review, comes upon us at the beginning of July. Not, in my view, enough. And that's why I'm grateful to ACN and Open Doors for their recent reports. Hear Her Cries and the Persecution of Christian Women and Girls. They are moving and critical. And indeed, when I read Hear Her Cries, as a woman, I cried. And I brought a copy here for the Minister today. I implore you to read it. It is heartrending. Recommendation 5 of the Truro Review reads this, and I read it for the record, and because, fortunately, we have the liberty today of some time here in this debate. Bolster research, this is what the Bishop recommended, and it was accepted by the FCDO. Bolster research into the critical intersection of FoRB and minority rights with both broader human rights issues, such as people trafficking, gender equality, gender-based violence, especially kidnapping, forced conversion and forced marriage, and other critical concerns for FCO, such as security, economic activity, etc., recognising the potential for religious identity to be a key marker of vulnerability. And this is the particularly important part of Recommendation 5, and use such research to articulate FoRB-focused policies to address these issues. That's a critical question posed by that last sentence. It's one I hope will be specifically considered by the independent reviewers of the Truro Review. That's the question. How has any such research that has been done by the FCDO been used to augment, amend or develop government policies over the last 2.5 years so that the UK can better help tackle the tragic global phenomenon of widespread FoRB violations against women and girls? What changes have been made to FCDO policies? Now, some good government-funded work relating to this issue has been done by the Coalition for Religious Equality and Inclusive Development, or CREED. And they state 4 reasons as to why women from religious minorities may be especially vulnerable to FoRB abuses. I'll summarise them briefly. Firstly, when women are poor and they belong to religious minorities in societies where people from a different faith are often reviewed as the other, someone different or alien, then women can be particularly powerless. They can expect very little support from society as a whole. And I'll give an example later of a migrant woman from Qatar who fits this example. Secondly, creeds say that in some societies, the bodies of women who belong to religious minorities are being used as battlegrounds in wider political and geostrategic struggles. This can lead to them being targeted for ideological reasons, and their vulnerable position in society makes them even more vulnerable. And an example, of course, and we heard it from the Honourable Member for Strangford, and I will refer back to it again shortly, are the Yazidis in and around 2014. But we also know of the Uyghurs in China now. terrible stories and accounts coming out of them being sexually abused, forcibly aborted. Thirdly, that some forms of sexual grooming of girls and women can be motivated by ideology. And again, I'll refer to this later, the example given by the Honourable Member for Strangford of the forced marriage and the forced conversion, justified by ideology from other faiths. And finally, women can face stigma, but not finally in terms of my speech, Minister and Madam Chairman. And finally, women can face stigma and discrimination in their own communities. Tragically, women who've been subjected to sexual violence are often seen as bringing shame on their community, and they can be targeted for honour-based violence from their own families and community. And this is why it's critical to work with whole communities, including religious leaders, to challenge the acceptability of violence against women, religiously motivated, and to bring about social change. We have got to make better explicit the links between gender, religion, marginality and poverty. Women in many countries appear to be victims not just of double but triple forms of persecution. They're women, they're of a particular religious or belief group, and because of their low socio-economic status. And they live in the margins. These different layers reinforce each other, making women particularly vulnerable. But it's insufficient for us to say we must raise awareness of the intersection of these vulnerabilities. We must be moved to action. Otherwise, religiously marginalised, economically excluded women will continue to fall through the cracks, experiencing appalling inequality, discrimination, persecution and violence, which will continue to be simply overlooked, ignored or minimised. And I do hope that the conference which the UK is hosting on the 5th and 6th of July this year on FoRB will promote some really practical steps as to how we can address this issue and encourage working together with the international community concerned about FoRB, encourage both governments and civil society to do so. I want to just unpack these thoughts a little, if I may, and I'm grateful to Stephanos Alliance International in this. They gave the example of the complexity of the causes of FoRB abuses against women by way of a migrant woman in Qatar, for example. There is already a lack of legal protection for Qatari women in general. Christians are also a minority group there. They do not enjoy the same level of rights and freedom as the majority Muslim population. So a foreign Christian woman working as a maid in Qatar, who can often have her immigration papers confiscated by her employer, has therefore little or no hope of legal protection should he abuse her. Just one example of the multi-layered intersectionality of human rights violations for women and why women can be particularly vulnerable to FoRB abuses. Another example of the differences between men and women in the terms of FoRB violations is, as I've mentioned, that they often occur against women when they are hidden and, tragically, often perpetrated within a woman's own home. Of course, that's where women spend much of their time, in the private sphere. Even, sadly, this is perpetrated by her own family or community. Practices such as FGM, sex-selective abortion, female infanticide, forced marriage, child marriage, sexual violence, marital rape, honour killings, the denial of access to work, all of these fall into the category of religiously motivated FoRB abuses at times. And if a woman converts to another religion, she may well have to face additional challenges from her own family, such as physical or emotional torture, to persuade her to deny her new faith. She may be excluded from family social networks, which can have severe consequences for a woman when these are her main, indeed sometimes her only social contacts. And leaving the family will not be an option when a woman whose educational and therefore job opportunities may also have been very limited and she is therefore financially dependent on her family. And two, sadly, her chances of any recourse to justice can be severely limited. Too often we hear of the police taking no action, or of local courts if a young woman applies there for justice when she has, for example, been forcibly married, receiving no justice at all from them. Sexual violence, sadly, means that often there are no evident public repercussions, and when there are no evident public repercussions for the perpetrator, this makes the continued targeting by others of women for their religious beliefs a low-risk activity because of the impunity related to such crimes in too many places. Sexual violence experienced by many women often remains unreported because of stigma and shame. And sadly, it's one of the most common forms of FoRB violations against women and many, many underage girls. The female body becomes a battlefield used by perpetrators to control a woman's personal faith or faith communities at large. I'm aware of one young woman in hiding now for well over a year in fear of her abductor who forcibly married, and when we talk about this we mean rape and often continuous rape. She is too frightened to come out of hiding for fear of the whole community. Rape is widely used as a weapon of armed conflict, as we've heard and saw during the 2014 Syrian conflict affecting the Yazidis. Thousands of Yazidi women were abducted and held as sex slaves by ISIS soldiers. I heard of one, a young woman called Eklas. She was captured by ISIS soldiers. And when she asked them, "Are you going to murder me?" they said, "Oh no, we're going to make you suffer much more than that." And they took her as a sex slave. Those women then have faced challenges if they tried to flee captivity, trying to reintegrate themselves into their communities, which have practices and regulations based around premarital intercourse or interreligious marriages. And as we now know, some 2,700 such women, many with children, remain missing today. I would appreciate it if the Minister could update me, perhaps not today, but in due course, as to what practical support and resources are being applied to help these women, following the answer which was given to me when I raised this question last on the 26th of October last year. Rape can also be used even in disputes between religious groups outside conflict. As creeds say, sexual grooming occurs of girls and women motivated by ideology. And shockingly, this can even sometimes be used with the appearance of respectability. Hundreds of Christian, Hindu and Sikh girls are reportedly abducted each year and forcibly married, justified by ideology. The ACN report Hear Her Cries relays the accounts of brave women of their kidnapping, forced conversion and sexual victimisation and unimaginable suffering. And I was going to read out the account of the little girl of Farah, aged 12, who was abducted in this way from her grandfather's home. I won't go into it because the Honourable Member read it, but that report, as I say, should do more than just move us to tears. It should move us to action. Tragically, also, whilst men are more likely to be killed as a result of religious persecution, they're also more likely than women to be celebrated as martyrs, whereas women subject to sexual abuse are not rewarded the same honour, but their complex trauma is often additionally burdened with re-traumatisation in the form of isolation and rejection from their very own faith communities. Blame falls on the victim. Suffering continues long after the event, and counselling is unavailable. So, what to do to address all of this? Perhaps I could ask the Minister to consider the following. We must ensure there is much wider help in terms of humanitarian assistance for such women, more extensive training for specialised trauma counselling. There need to be targeted programmes of aid for women and girls who face vulnerabilities as women of faith or belief, with those factors being clearly recognised as criteria of vulnerability by UK aid. Women need to be involved in designing and implementing aid and other support programmes. There needs to be strengthened dialogue and cooperation between women's rights activists and FoRB activists to help overcome a perception that achieving FoRB for all women is perceived as incompatible with women's rights. We need to call out when authorities in countries, including governments at the highest level, and I implore the Minister, whenever the opportunity occurs, to do so. We need to call out abusers when authorities turn a blind eye or tragically even condone at times action, such as, for example, where local policing or that country's legal system fails to protect women subject to FoRB abuses. We must ensure that steps are taken against perpetrators to hold them to account and end the cultures of impunities. We must better learn how to identify early warning signs to avert atrocities and work with others in the international community to better do so. We must challenge those governments who have put FoRB in their constitutions or signed up to international treaties like Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but don't apply them. We must gather data to better understand the double or triple jeopardy of women who are members of religious minorities, often also amongst the poorest and most vulnerable in their societies. More dialogue must be promoted within and across religious communities, including women at all times, to reflect on traditional practices such as patriarchal ones, which have a negative impact on FoRB. We must help women in local communities voice their concerns. We need to look at how we can use the Declaration of Humanity, which was launched by Lord Armand, our Human Rights Minister, during the pandemic. It has not perhaps had the profile and subsequent impact it could have. There is more to do. What can the Minister tell me of how the UK government, which commissioned it, could help take this forward? And just because the Truro Review, which is a manifesto commitment, 3-year review deadline will shortly be upon us, is no reason for us not to continue to work on Recommendation 5 and on all the other recommendations. We must not stop just because the 3-year period of the Truro Review ends this July. Much more needs to be done. In closing, can I highlight to the Minister that from my experience working on FoRB in depth and detail over the past year and 3 months or so as the Prime Minister's Special Envoy for Freedom of Religion or Belief, I do not believe that championing FoRB and calling out its abuses across the world is sufficiently embedded in the culture of the FCDO today. Experience has shown me that the FCDO, both at desks here and at posts in countries, need to be bolder and more public in calling out specific cases of FoRB abuses, not least relating to some of the women we've heard of today. Inadequate advocacy is being provided for individual cases of concern. I'm not being appropriately encouraged to undertake it. Tailored responses are not being provided to me when I raise individual cases of concern. Generic remarks in response to my raising such cases, such as FoRB is a key human rights priority for the UK, are simply not good enough. Nor is the argument that, well, it's better to raise such cases in private. One such case I've been concerned about for almost 1.5 years, and officials are aware of it, and still the poor girl continues to suffer. Arguments that raising a case by name could put an individual woman in danger when she is already effectively being imprisoned and at risk of mob violence are unacceptable, particularly when so-called in private advocacy appears to yield little result. In one such case, I was asked not to raise the name, not to name a young girl who'd been abducted because it might put her at risk. She'd been abducted by Boko Haram. She was at risk. Her family wanted her case raising. It's very interesting that we stand here today celebrating the freedom of Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, whose plight has not been out of the public domain for 6 years. I'll close with the words of Eleanor Roosevelt, one of the architects of the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. She said, "Where do universal rights begin? In small places, close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Yet they are the world of the individual person, the neighbourhood they live in, the school or college they attend, the factory, the farm, the office where they work. Such are the places where every man, woman and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere."
SNP spokesperson Lisa Cameron.
Thank you, Ms Rees. It's an absolute pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today, and I'd like to personally thank the Honourable Member for Strangford, who shows such dedication to freedom of religion or belief in his work throughout Parliament, and has a magnificent impact, not just across the UK, but internationally in the role that he serves as chair of that group, and has great respect and esteem from cross-party colleagues in that regard. And also to follow on from the Honourable Member for Congleton, who is just doing tremendous work. Really, we're so privileged to have the Honourable Member in her post as the Prime Minister's Special Envoy for freedom of religion or belief. It's at the heart of what she does. It's at the heart of the work she champions in Parliament across the UK and internationally. And my own constituents are so delighted and privileged that she's going to be visiting us in a couple of months' time to speak about this work in East Kilbride, Straven and Lesmahago in my constituency, and to hear about the value of this work, because they feel it's so very important. And when we're celebrating International Women's Day, we talk about the progress that we've made in the United Kingdom, and that in itself is fantastic. And certainly I have had more opportunities than my mother did, and my mother had more opportunities than my grandmother, and we've made significant progress. We all hope that our own children will have better opportunities, and I have two girls of my own that I want to succeed in whatever makes them happy in life. But we cannot forget those across the world who live lives under the sphere of persecution, whose opportunities are dashed, and whose skills and ability to contribute is curtailed purely because they're believed to have the wrong religion or belief in the country that they were born in. So it's an honour to be speaking here today. The subject matter is very grave and disquieting. This debate itself was inspired by a recent event held by Aid to the Church in Need and Open Doors, two charities that support persecuted minorities, and the event called The Forgotten Women, held on International Women's Day and raising awareness of the many, many women from religious minorities who suffer grievous persecution because they are deemed to be of the wrong faith. I've worked with the Catholic charity Aid to the Church in Need for many years, and I have been very humbled reading their report, Hear Her Cries, about the kidnapping, forced conversion and sexual victimisation of Christian women and girls. The report is very disturbing in terms of its findings, that we have to acknowledge and act in the higher echelons of government, nationally and internationally. An example, according to the Christian Association of Nigeria, 95% of women abducted by Boko Haram in Nigeria are Christian. In Pakistan, research from the All-Party Parliamentary Group has suggested that 1,000 Christian and Hindu girls each year are abducted to be forcibly converted and married. Other research says every year 1,000 girls are abducted from the Sindh province alone, so we think this may be only the tip of the iceberg that's even coming out in the research itself. When I was on the International Development Select Committee, I had the privilege of meeting with the Bring Back Our Girls campaign and the mothers who were devastated that they had sent their children to school to give their girls education. in good faith, wanting the best for them as we do for our children, and those girls didn't return. And what, is happening there, that some of those girls have been returned, but more girls have been taken. So what is the government there doing? I know it's one of the biggest countries in terms of the aid that we donate. I know that my constituents want our aid money to go to governments who want to tackle inequality, who want to ensure that the most vulnerable are protected, and that where that is not happening, that government very seriously questions their commitment to working with those governments, at least raising those issues repeatedly and ensuring that action is taken is the very least that we can do. A case study demonstrating the brutality and injustice that women have to contend with, Rana al-Messiah's case, was also featured in Aid to the Church in Need. Hear Her Cries report. She vanished from the Mina village in Menufa Governorate of Egypt on the 22nd of April 2020. And a few days later, a video was released on social media. Rania, a devout Christian who was active in her local Coptic Orthodox church, appeared wearing a Muslim al-Amira headscarf, saying she had converted to Islam 9 years previously. She said she had left her home of her own free will, taking her jewellery with her and then reciting the Shahada, the Islamic profession of faith. Yet her family were very suspicious, particularly as, contrary to what she said in the video, none of her jewellery was missing. Her brother Raymond said she was definitely kidnapped and forced to make that video. He added she had been threatened and coerced. The family also claimed the police knew where she was being held. No progress was made, though, until the local diocese, led by Coptic Orthodox Bishop Benjamin of Menufa, took up her case. After protests and a threat to leave a government-backed interfaith initiative by the Assembly of Priests, Rania was eventually released. She declared that she had not converted to Islam, which was backed up by Al-Azhar, the Islamic authority which registers conversions to Islam, and who agreed that in Islam there can be no compulsion in religion. And Bishop Benjamin later confirmed that Rania had indeed been kidnapped, having been forced into a car by 2 women. He said the police had told the family not to talk publicly about the case, despite their daughter having been kidnapped, adding he was aware of 15 similar cases of kidnapping. During the almost 3 months that she was held, she was both sexually and psychologically abused by her captors. It is clear that Christian women like Rania and those of other religious minorities are being persecuted as we speak here today because of their faith. Yet how often do we hear their stories in the press? What is the UK government doing to help women like them? And what about the United Nations? If MPs cross-party don't raise our voices, then in the fight of gender-related violence, women from religious minorities will indeed continue to be the forgotten women. In a case study from Mozambique, Anya, not her real name, but in the report from Aid to the Church in Need, gave an insight into the fate faced by Christian girls in Mozambique when kidnapped by Islamic extremists who are currently waging an insurgency in the country. After her release, she said Christian girls were given a choice: convert to Islam and marry a fighter, or become slaves. She said for those who were Christians who didn't want to convert, they would be chosen by the soldiers to be their slaves. This was confirmed by Father Fonseca of the Pemba Diocese in Mozambique, who said, Christian girls face a real threat of abduction, rape and forced conversion and marriage because the fighters are able to do anything. They can basically do what they want, he added. Christian women are being kidnapped, not all alone but with other women. It is a phenomenon taking place where the terrorists are and where the fighting is taking place. The Honourable Member for Strangford described the case of Farah Shahim, the Christian girl living in Pakistan who was kidnapped, and I was too going to raise that case, but I think he has done so in great detail. I think it also highlights the need to review the work that has been done in conjunction with the government of Pakistan to make sure that the most vulnerable do have assistance and the benefit of our support in relation to our UK aid. As I said, those constituents, in my constituency, and I'm quite sure across the United Kingdom, want to make sure that the most vulnerable receive the aid and that those cases of persecution and injustice are dealt with by the governments that we are assisting. I note, with regards to the APPG report on the situation in Pakistan in 2021, that in response to the report, the Foreign Office Minister, Lord Ahmed, expressed the UK government's disappointment that draft legislation criminalising forced conversions had actually stalled in Pakistan's parliament in 2021. And the UK government said it has regularly raised the issue with the government of Pakistan, but what action are they taking? And what further work can be done in this regard? Just to finish, I want to briefly ask the Minister if he can build upon the recommendations made by my honourable colleagues, and also perhaps, and I hope I'm not speaking out of turn as the Treasurer for the All-Party Group for Freedom of Religion or Belief, could we meet with the Department and ask them about the programmes that are underway to address freedom of religion or belief with the FCDO, because I think it's very important across party clearly, and it's something that we believe we could lend support to, but also lend some weight to, and we're very keen to meet with those officials who are involved in this work to make sure that action is being taken forward and also that there could be regular reviews of the progress being made. When we think about the freedoms we have today, we have come a long way, but I think collectively working together we can help not just those women in the UK who are very important in all of our constituencies, but internationally, women and girls who are experiencing persecution due to lack of acceptance of their religion or belief, and do all that we can to support their need at this crucial time.
Opposition spokesperson Sarah Owen.
And it's a pleasure to see you in the chair. May I start by wishing all those celebrating for the rest of today a happy Purim, happy Holy Festival for tomorrow, and a happy St. Patrick's Day for today. It's been an absolute privilege to have heard these powerful speeches here today, each case as heartbreaking and as shocking as the last. I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for Strangford and the Honourable Member for East Kilbride for their leadership in this area. Along with other members of this House, they have fought for the rights of persecuted religious minorities with dedication and heart. The APPG for freedom of religion or belief is an invaluable resource in pushing these rights forward. We have our own desperate problems with violence against women and girls in the UK, which we must attend to. But we cannot take our eye off the rest of the world. With members like these in the House, I know we won't. I'd also like to pay thanks and tribute to the work of organisations such as Open Doors, who honourable members have already mentioned today. But no courage can ever match up to that displayed by those very people who are being persecuted. Today we have heard stories of women and girls who have stood tall in the face of death and danger while continuing to worship in such dangerous environments. It is clear to us that the perpetrators of these crimes against women are not motivated by genuine religious faith. These atrocities are driven not by a pursuit of God, but a pursuit of power, an often masculine determination to enforce patriarchy to the extreme. Female genital mutilation continues to be used as a weapon against young women and girls. It has absolutely no place in any culture in 2022, regardless of religious belief or practices. It is misogynistic torture that causes physical injuries and lifelong psychological damage. Along with my honourable friends, I would be grateful to hear from the Minister what action Britain is taking to end this grotesque practice worldwide. Families across Nigeria, as we have heard already today, remain heartbroken for their daughters and sisters stolen from them. Boko Haram are pursuing war against women's rights to freedom of religion, education, employment and marriage. What hope are we offering to these families and the girls themselves?
I did ask the business question of the Leader of the House today in the House, just to illustrate the 50 killings of men, women and children in north-east Nigeria. In the Democratic Republic of DRC, And I was hoping maybe the Minister, perhaps maybe in responding to that, might be able to give us some indication of any help that we can give those authorities there to try and find the perpetrators, number one, but also to give support. Thank you.
Thank you. I thank the Honourable Member for his intervention, and I hope the Minister has taken notes of all the questions that have been asked today. The past year has reminded us what horrors the Taliban could inflict upon women and girls in Afghanistan, starting with banning girls from schools with such devastating impact. When the overseas aid budget was slashed, warnings were raised that this would be to the detriment of girls' education worldwide. So can the Minister assure us that providing safety and education to girls, including those suffering from religious oppression, is still an objective of this government? Christians are also at an intensified risk in Afghanistan under the new regime. Christian women face being forced into marriages and conversion. Now, will the Minister please tell us whether there are still asylum routes open to Christians and open to women and girls fleeing persecution in Afghanistan? In China, the CCP regime flattens anyone and anything that challenges the prescribed ideology. Christians are forced underground and risk detainment just for owning a Bible. And in Xinjiang, as we've heard already, Uyghur Muslims are victims of genocide due to their religion and ethnicity. And while thousands of Uyghurs are known to be slaving away in cotton fields, we also know that particular brutalities are saved for women. They have been sexually assaulted, tortured, had their children stolen from them, and forcibly sterilised. The Chinese Communist Party is motivated by the same principles as the Taliban, Boko Haram, Islamic State, and others. This is about the ruthless pursuit of domination. Faith is not a factor in this religious persecution, only power. And while the government did last year concede that what is underway in Xinjiang is genocide, we've seen very little change in our national response. Every day, the Uyghur Muslims face ethnic cleansing, and other religious minorities, including Christians, live in fear of being found out by their oppressive government. So will the Minister advise us on what steps are being taken to address the dangers faced by these minorities in China? And Human Rights Watch has highlighted government policy in India as reflecting bias against Muslims. Since October 2018, Indian authorities have deported over a dozen Rohingya Muslims, including women and children, to Myanmar, despite the risk to their lives and to their security. And in May 2019, the government revoked the constitutional autonomy of India's only Muslim-majority state, Jammu and Kashmir, deployed additional troops, detained thousands of people, and cut off phone and internet connections, with women and girls reporting rapes, attacks, and living in a constant state of fear. The world risks looking more divided than ever when there is no Department for International Development. Although we were promised the cuts to international aid were temporary, the budget has not been restored. What hopes does this give for women and girls around the world who need our help? What future is there for our own humanitarian interventions? And what damage has this done to Britain's standing in the world stage? Especially at a time when this is all compounded by a Prime Minister who was chosen to visit Saudi Arabia following the execution of 81 people. As I mentioned earlier, faith is by and large a force for good in the world, a very powerful force for good in the world. Just look at the way people of faith are stepping forward to lead the welcome for Ukrainian refugees, just as they did Syrians, the Afghans, the Hong Kongers. And throughout the pandemic, churches, mosques, temples, gurdwaras, synagogues served their communities throughout the pandemic with compassion and hospitality. We're lucky. We live in a country where community cohesion may not be perfect, but everyone has the right to express their beliefs with freedom and safety. But that should not be a privilege. It should be a basic human right. Female believers here are protected, largely from forced marriage, FGM and other abuses, and have access and rights to healthcare and reproductive healthcare. Yet, we know that there have been shocking increases in Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, with women and children in schools bearing the brunt of that again. We've had Muslim women increasingly subjected to horrific Islamophobic abuse in the streets, online, and even death threats. There have also been approximately 2 million anti-Semitic tweets seen in the UK, and that is just on one platform alone. So it would be good to hear from the Minister what they have to say about the tackling the rising religious persecution that we are seeing in our own country. This summer, we are due to host a global summit on the freedom of religion and belief in London. It is very welcome that the Foreign Secretary has marked this issue as a priority in her brief. However, as hosts of this conference, we must be able to lead with integrity. That means using the full range of financial and political resources we have to intervene in religious persecution of all kinds. I've posed many questions to the Minister today, as have many of the other speakers. So I'll give him an opportunity to respond. I know there will be consensus that we have a moral duty to intervene in these areas of gross violence, suppression and misogyny. That is clear with every debate that we have on religious persecution. My hope from the Minister is that we no longer need to keep having these debates to encourage our government to make the interventions that are needed.
Thank you, Ms Rees, and it is a pleasure to serve with you in the chair. I'm grateful, very grateful, for the honourable member for Strangford for bringing this debate. This is a topic which he speaks on with great passion, with great compassion, with great knowledge, particularly in light of his chairmanship of the APPG for the promotion of freedom of religion or belief. And I know the honourable lady, the member for Kilbride, Stratharven and Leslie fulfills a dual role, because I have no doubt that were she not in her party's spokesperson role in this debate, she would be speaking there with as much passion and conviction as she does. And I'd also like to thank her for the custodianship of the office that the FCDO has in Scotland. And I'd also like, I think this is, I'm pretty sure actually, this is the first time that I have responded as a minister for the honourable lady in her position as Shadow Minister, and I welcome her to her post. I'll try and address the points she raised, and of course it would be remiss of me, and I will mention her later on in my remarks, it would be remiss of me if I didn't also congratulate the speech made by my honourable friend, the member for Condalton, and also congratulate her in her role as the Prime Minister's envoy for this incredibly important area. Freedom of religion or belief is a universal human right, but as has been highlighted by everyone that's spoken today in one way or another, it is denied to millions around the world. And attacks on this freedom go hand in hand with attacks on other human rights. It goes hand in hand with other violations. It goes hand in hand with other abuses. And it has been mentioned that, of course, religious persecution is not limited to women, but the simple truth is, just in so many other areas, the plight of women when it comes to this is often amplified, is often made worse, and as we have heard on a number of occasions, and I'll make reference to this also in my speech, it is not just the religious persecution, but it is the use of sexual violence which makes this even more horrific, even more painful, even more pernicious. And a number of the people that have spoken today have highlighted specific examples of where women have been the recipients of the most appalling sexual violence and abuse. And as the Honourable Lady says, it is done in the name of religion, but it has nothing to do with religion. And we have to recognise this. The recent report from Aid to the Church in Need shone a light on how women and girls are particularly vulnerable to being targeted, as I say, with sexual violence, using religious belief as an excuse. Some have been forced to convert, often under pain of death. And in the face of such grave attacks on human rights, it is up to the world's democracies, of course, including the United Kingdom, to champion freedom for all. That's why we continue to work in close coordination with our international partners on a range of measures to address this. From our work through the UN to call out the violations of human rights and to call for support for those affected, to the aid projects that are working at the grassroots with communities, with religious leaders to protect the rights of minorities. My noble friend, the Lord Ahmed of Wimbledon, is leading in these efforts at a ministerial level, and the Prime Minister, as I said, the Minister for these rights and the Prime Minister's Special Representative for preventing sexual violence in conflict. In November 2020, Lord Ahmed launched the Declaration of Humanity. This united leaders from many faiths and beliefs in a common front, calling for the prevention of sexual violence in conflict and denouncing the stigma faced by survivors, a point that the Honourable Gentleman made. And that's a stigma which in some cases prevents women and girls seeking refuge in the families that they grew up in. The declaration attracted strong support. More than 50 leaders from countries including Iraq, Kosovo, Sierra Leone and Sri Lanka have thus far signed it. And I know that the Lord Ahmed works closely with the Prime Minister's Special Envoy on this issue. I'm going to embarrass her now, so I hope she prepares for this. She is such a powerful advocate, and I admire her hugely for this. I know she's strongly engaged, very effectively engaged with advocacy groups. I knew I was going to struggle getting that one out for some reason, including Open Doors and Aid to the Church in Need, who recently hosted an International Women's Day event. As my honourable friend said at that event, we must continue to call out countries who fail to take action, whilst continuing to work at grassroots level to effect change. And we know that communities are stronger when everyone is included. So I would like to highlight some projects that are already making a difference around the world. The Honourable Gentleman and others have mentioned Pakistan, and in Pakistan we are funding programmes to protect women and girls, including protection from religious or belief minority communities, protecting them from forced marriage and gender-based violence. And we're working with community leaders at village level to try and change social behaviours, because changing the position of government, and the Honourable Lady mentioned the stalling of legislation that goes through, and of course we will continue to encourage Pakistan to pursue the right legislation, but legislation and governmental action alone is not enough, which is why we do seek to influence at grassroots level as well through the funding that we provide, through the ODA funding that we provide, which is directed towards Pakistan. And we've supported the government of Pakistan to set up 8 courts to provide child-sensitive justice to victims of child abuse, child trafficking and child marriage. The plight in Afghanistan was raised, and of course we backed the UN Human Rights Council resolution to establish the mandate for a special rapporteur to monitor and report on the human rights situation there. And this includes the challenges faced by women and girls from religious or indeed non-religious communities. And we are directly supporting the United Nations Population Fund activities to prevent gender-based violence and launched with the International Rescue Committee, programming specifically designed for the protection of women and girls. The Honourable Lady asked about the resettlement scheme, and we are providing 20,000 women and girls and others at risk with a safe route to resettlement in UK, and we're on track to resettle an estimated 5,000 this year. The situation in Syria remains grave, but we're working to support women and girls affected by human rights violations and abuses, including freedom of religion or belief, through our National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security. And we've allocated £22 million to the UN Population Fund in Syria to support this work. The awful situation in Iraq was raised by a number of members, particularly the persecution perpetrated by Daesh. We have seen horrific crimes perpetrated by that group. Many are still living in difficult conditions because they have children born of sexual violence and face very significant barriers to rejoining their community because of that stigma. My honourable friend for Congleton took a leading role in pushing for the International Religious Freedom or Belief Alliance statement, calling for minority communities displaced by Daesh to be allowed to return home in safe, voluntary and sustainable ways. The situation in China was raised with great passion by the Honourable Lady for Luton North. We must keep the situation in Xinjiang in the public eye. Where there is evidence of the scale and severity of human rights violations being perpetrated against the Uyghur Muslims, we can see that it is far-reaching and it paints a truly harrowing picture. Reports, as she said, including forced sterilisation and testimonies of rape and torture and forced separation of families. Such terrible violations of human rights must be called out, must be highlighted on the international stage, and that's why the Foreign Secretary challenges these violations. That's why she challenged these violations in an address to the UN Human Rights Council earlier this month. The honourable gentleman and others highlighted or asked about the situation in northeast Nigeria. And there are ongoing attacks by terrorist groups, including Boko Haram and Islamic State West Africa, which have caused immense suffering to Muslim and Christian communities as these groups seek to undermine community cohesion. They seek to split communities apart. It is something which the UK government takes a close interest in, and we continue to work with the Nigerian government. He spoke about, the Honourable Lady spoke about those girls who were taken by Boko Haram, many of whom have still not been returned, many of whom their whereabouts is still unknown. Of course, we condemn unreservedly the abduction of those girls. We continue to call for and work towards their release, and we will continue to work with the Nigerian government on those cases and other cases that are well known. Looking ahead, the United Kingdom will host a Freedom of Religion or Belief conference in July, as has been mentioned. This will be a critical moment for us to drive collective action and promote respect between different religious and indeed non-religious communities around the world. Planning is underway, and my honourable friend, the member for Congleton, I know, will continue her key role in helping to deliver that. And she knows, we know, that she pushes us hard in the department. She works with great passion, great alacrity, and I'm quite sure that my officials and ministerial colleagues will not thank me for saying this, but she plays an incredibly important role in ensuring that we work with the same speed and passion as she does, and she holds our feet to the fire, which is perhaps not exactly how the Prime Minister envisaged the envoy role. But nevertheless, she plays an important part, as do the shadow front bench, as do the members of all party parliamentary groups, because this has got to remain a collective endeavour. I will.
As today as to whether or not, as members of the all-party group, that we could visit the department to hear about the work that's being done directly.
I have. I shot a quick look across to my officials. They have heard that request. I'll be completely honest with you. At the moment, the situation in Ukraine means we are still in response mode to that. So the normal generosity of spirit that my department demonstrates is being stretched somewhat. But we do recognise this is an important issue. We will seek to find a time as soon as possible to liaise, and I suspect that the cavalry are going to ride to my rescue.
Yes, thank you, Minister, for allowing me to do. I'd be delighted to facilitate such a meeting in the department.
Told you. Look, this is, as has been said, this is at times shocking and painful when we hear specific cases, as have been brought up in the committee today. They are harrowing beyond belief. There are people who, in their communities and societies, are already the least powerful, have the most suppressed voices, and once again find themselves the target of misogynistic persecution and attack and sexual violence in the name of religion, but not driven really honestly by that religion. So we will continue to champion freedom and democracy around the world, freedom of religion or belief, gender rights. These will remain at the forefront of our international efforts as a government. Thank you, Chair.
Alan, would you like a couple of minutes to sum up?
Yes, Madam Chair, I will. And thank you very much. First of all, can I thank all members for giving their contributions. The Honourable Lady for Congleton, who is very... I thought it was funny, Madam Chair. Not funny, but certainly shows the power of the Honourable Lady for Congleton whenever she said, I would like to facilitate that meeting. The Minister instantaneously agreed. So that tells you about the power of the Honourable Lady, and, as I say, the Minister, who is very accommodating as well. So thank him for that. The Honourable Lady referred to the forced marriages, the gender violence. She referred to when you're poor, you're even more vulnerable, more chastised more because of your religious belief. She referred to women financially dependent on husbands. Female body has become the battlefield, the Honourable Lady referred to as well. Honourable Lady for East Kilbride, Strathaven and Nesmagow, as always, brings a real good contribution. She gave us many examples. She referred to the kidnappings in Egypt, the Mozambique. Again, the most vulnerable have our support and assistance, but very often they don't have it where they need it. And the Honourable Lady is absolutely right. The Honourable Lady for Lytton North, very pleased, as I said earlier on, to see her in her place, and with the energy and the commitment and the words that are so important. Honourable Lady referred to girls' education and their safety, referred to Nigeria, to Afghanistan, to China for the Christians and the Uyghurs as well. Also referred to ethnic groups' right to worship must be protected. And the Minister, can I thank in conclusion him for his very, very positive response to the issues that we wish to see in place. He gave us plenty of good thoughts, and which we wish to take on board. He referred to many countries as well. He also referred to the Special Rapporteur in Afghanistan, to Pakistan, where the protection for women and girls is looking for change. In Syria, he referred to women and girls and money that was set aside to help there in Iraq. I refer to ISIS and Daesh, and also in China. And I conclude with this last. I always like to conclude, Madam Chair, with a scripture text, because I think it's important to do so, because that's what drives us in this chamber. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9, and it says, "Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover up for evil, but living as servants of God." I think today, Madam Chair, we have perhaps done that, and ever aware that we not here for our own purposes, we're here for the purposes of the man above. And for me, that's what it's all about. Madam Chair, thank you so much.
The question is that this House has considered gender-specific religious persecution. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order. The sit-in stands adjourned.